I am here with a man whose writing I'm a great admirer of. He goes by Liquid Swan. We'll call him Swan for the duration of this episode. You can find him at liquidswan.substack.com. He's also a writer at praxarchy.com. You can find him over on Twitter X at Liquid Swan. So thank you very much for taking the time to sit down with me today, Swan.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so I'm just going to quickly go through what we were just talking about. For the people listening, there's 3 articles that I'm going to be referencing for this talk that I would encourage people to read in full on their own on his Substack, liquidswan.substack.com. The 3 are Canada in Crisis, Infrastructure Deficits, and Exodus. And Exodus will be the pivotal one for me. And Swan, you said you had delivered this as a speech at a Shieldings event recently. Is that correct?
Yes, just this past June in Nashville.
And I'd heard from some people that this was a very, very great speech. A lot of people liked it. I hadn't heard it. I'd only just read it, but it's very poetic, and I really enjoy it. And I'll be quoting some parts from it here. But Swan is another Canadian guy. We like to have Canadian guys on here. And these articles pertain to not a debate, but back and forth between myself and my co-host, Judas, on the topic of what is to be done as a Canadian going forward in Canada. So do you stay and fight? Do you, even if it's to the bitter end, or do you pack up and look for greener pastures elsewhere? And we'll get to the specifics on that later. But he is more of the mind of the stay and fight to the bitter end. I am more fluid on that topic. And before we started, I just wanted to ask you, Swan, very quickly. I know you're writing, but I don't know a whole lot about you, not just personally, but professionally as well. I was wondering, do you have any professional dealings? Do you have any story about what brought you to this point politically, or any personal experience about what made you passionate about this topic?
Well, what really, I used to be, so on the West Coast, almost everyone that's, like, let's say a union member, is an NDP voter, basically. My dad was an NDP voter. My grandpa was an NDP voter. A lot of my family were NDP voters. So naturally, I was doing that at some point. But at some point, I was in the party and realizing that everyone around me was like a resentful loser. And I was like, but I wasn't. And I started putting two and two together. And eventually, I kind of broke through the fourth wall. I broke through, and I realized that like I'm actually kind of a traditionalist thinker, and I shouldn't be with these people. They're toxic. They're shit. And so I started like writing my thoughts down, and here I am now.
Well, I'm curious. So, for people who are listening who are not Canadian, who don't know, the NDPs, the New Democratic Party, on the political spectrum, they would be further left than the Liberal Party, who are already pretty far left as it is. I was curious about how you. So, would you call yourself like an NDP member until fairly recently? And was this a recent shift for you?
I think up until no, this probably goes back to 2012. When I started kind of walking away from it. Actually, I ran for office locally at one point, sort of as like a, working man sort of NDP guy, not like the sort of Kakistan NDP guys, right? But either way, I ended up walking away from it. I worked for a couple committees in city council, and I started learning how like things worked, and I was chairing them, and I was dealing with this electorate that was I felt kind of stupid. And so eventually I walked away from that too. But what got me away from the NDP, I think, was eventually I read this book, The Road to Serfdom, because I was sort of like caught in sort of like the brainwashing for a long time, because I had all these friends and these networks. Everything networked here is like left wing. So you basically have to kind of like find new friends when you eventually get out of it. And where was I going with this? I eventually, yeah.
I was curious, like if the majority of where you are geographically was NDP, where was there to break off to? Like, did you have to completely change your, friend group when you did this, and like how tilted towards, let's say, progressivism was the area you were in?
Oh, it's like basically communist. Like it's like one step away from communist. If you said they were communist, or if you told them that, they would like laugh because they would think it's ridiculous. But like the spiritual philosophy that they have is communism. It's like based in
Now,
resentment.
Now, and that's an interesting point. And I was going to follow up by asking, what about? And I'm not asking this in a judgmental way. I am curious because
Yeah.
everyone's got their own unique stories. What was it about the NDP that you found attractive? Was it just that that was the majority of where you were, and you kind of went with it, or did something in that party speak to you over, let's say, the Liberal Party?
Well, it originally started because I would listen to my grandfather, and I have a lot of respect for my grandfather. I love him very much. He just passed away this last April at the age of 97. But he was back in the Depression when everyone was really, really poor. His father left the family, so he was like sort of the man of the family at that point at like 7 years old, and he went working for for the woodworkers union, and so and his mother I think was working as well, but she was getting subsidized by the government. It was like one of the first sort of welfare schemes back in the day. It was something like $7 a month, and she had like 7 kids altogether. And so I always heard these stories about how hard it was back then, and how like finally like the government sort of like stepped up and helped these poor families and women that got abandoned by their husbands during the Depression. And so I kind of and he used to campaign for the CCF, which was the precursor to the NDP, which is the Canadian Commonwealth Federation. And so I kind of had like a family element out of respect to my grandfather, who otherwise is pretty traditional, you know. And I guess growing up in the Depression, maybe he has like had a different perspective. I think he pretty much held that perspective his entire life, until the end, where I kind of converted him more to be traditional, a little bit more traditional. But that's basically what I think drew me to it, was the sort of family bond.
Yeah, and
But
that's an interesting
yeah,
way to put it. And a lot of people might forget that it would not be bizarre for a traditionally minded man to tilt more towards socialist policies, especially if it was about the working man, the working class, and things like that. It like being what you might call a progressive in that sense wouldn't come bundled with what the current NDP is. And for a lot of people, when I was growing up, the NDP, we think of it now as the Jagmeet Singh and it's all this kooky stuff. But when I was growing up, it was very much almost, I don't want to call it a cult of personality, but it was really tied to the personality of Jack Layton.
yeah,
So people liked Jack Layton, and he was sort of like, oh, I'm on the side of the working man. Then it became this progressive, identitarian, weird, very openly leftist thing. But up until the death of Jack Layton, I'm like, I could see someone like your grandfather being with it.
yeah, exactly. I actually met Leighton. He was like a kind of a normal guy, I guess, but then he died of cancer, and then the whole party went to. I mean, it was kind of shit before, but it kind of went way further to the left. You know.
Also, a lot of the older generations, they tended to be single issue voters. Like my father-in-law, he is on the younger side of being a baby boomer, and he voted for Justin Trudeau literally just to get weed legalized. That was his issue. And
Yeah,
that was, being a single issue voter to younger people sounds insane, obviously. But for a lot of the generation, it's like, here's the one thing I want, who's doing the one thing. You don't think in this abstract, systemic, ideological way. So even if he doesn't like Trudeau now, he's like, I can smoke weed in my apartment now, so my life is set politically.
and I can see how that could make sense because, like, a lot of times in politics, nothing gets done, like nothing changes. Like they're arresting people for marijuana, like who cares, right? Like I don't smoke marijuana, but like who cares? Like arresting people for that, stupid. Um, but uh, but at least that got done, so now we're not arresting people for marijuana. So I mean, if everything else, I mean, things have gotten much worse in other ways, but no one was suspecting that when I guess remember when they cast their ballot, they weren't going, yeah, I'm going to vote for a fucked up economy. I want fucking 1 million immigrants a year and all this other shit, and this is what we got. So
Yeah. Think about all the political capital Donald Trump could have accumulated if he actually just did imprison Hillary Clinton.
oh, it
Just
would have been amazing.
if he could have tied his legacy to that, that would have been, what, all things considered, he did. Even if he liked Hillary Clinton, that would be a really funny thing to happen. That would go in the history
Yeah,
books.
that would have been sweet.
Um, well, that's a very interesting story about how you get here because a lot of Canadians, um, Americans will find this bewildering, but there's really no libertarian streak in Canada. There is now, more than ever before, but historically there didn't really seem to be. Especially if you were in the latter half of the 20th century, it just seemed like liberalism all the way down, and you could try and grasp at something claiming to be conservatism, but it always would slip through your fingers, right? Like the complaints levied against the Republicans and the conservatives in the U.S. is, triply so up here.
Yeah.
Um, and you had just mentioned a couple of things there, like the migrant crisis and everything. And I think in your article, Canada in Crisis really lays out a lot of the issues that we've discussed in the show before, and a lot of people will be familiar with. But there's this one segment here, because we're always thinking about house prices and whatnot, right? And
Hmm.
there was this little paragraph here. I'm just going to read it for people. I found it very interesting. And it said, you had said the average cost of housing for all Canada, as I write this, is around $656,000. If we consider that housing will continue to increase in cost given the proposed population growth through mass migration, we know that multiplying the average housing price with the needed houses will give us the lowest estimated price possible. This equals just under $17 trillion dollars. And then you later on say tripling our population makes no sense the way we are planning to. The manipulation of the interpretation of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms by an activist judiciary will make us no different from any third world dictatorship. Genocide of the people who made Canada what it is will simply make Canada something completely different. And democracy itself must be put up to question. Where does the buck stop? Can the mess be fixed? We need answers. And I think the migration crisis as a dollars and cents problem, you were expressing it very well here, that as the government of Canada releases its not only projected numbers but desired numbers, it seems like a shockingly mismanaged goal that they have. And once we see that, oh, they're talking about by the year 2100 they want to have something to the tune of was like 50 million Canadian or 100 million
100
Canadians.
million. The Century Project, I believe it's called.
Yeah, it's utterly preposterous. And actually, we're going to be publishing an article on our site, the Vanguardist Journal, that you might find very interesting. It's not up yet, but it
Hmm.
will be by the time this airs. And the working title, the title we'll probably go with is "Paving Over Public Opinion." This is an article written by a someone else, not myself, and I'm not going to name them because they use their real name. I need to double check if they want to use their real name for this. But it's a historical, it's like an essay made into an article outlining how the mass migration phenomena over the course of the 20th century was never actually voted on, and it was enacted against public opinion, and you can actually track public opinion. We have census data, we have public polling on what people said they thought about mass migration in the post-war years right up until now. And it seemed very clear that Canadians, the government was proposing a plan as far back as the fucking 50s and the 40s, that we need to grow. We need population growth, and we need population growth. First of all, people didn't agree that we needed population growth. Whenever it
Yeah.
was put up to the public, they said why and no. Second of all, they said correctly that, well, if there is population growth, all the biggest population booms in the 19th and 20th centuries were done natively, just through increased birth rates. That's what the fucking baby boomers are, right? But people, they kept asking the public. The public said we didn't want it, but they did it anyway. So this idea of Canada being, aside from the nation of immigrants thing, but a nation that was always accepting and seeking out immigration, was a lie until the machinery of the state and the bureaucracy sort of gerrymandered it and brought in the immigrants anyway. Then they could vote for it and say, oh, we were like this the whole time. Which is to say
Hmm.
that this plan for growth through immigration has been going on long enough that it's been normalized to people, and that's what's the scariest thing to me. And I think that's where we arrive at now, where I think people are realizing that this doesn't make sense, but it's almost too fucking late, because people should be mad and they're not. Now, what do you think of all that I just said?
I think with Canadians, they sort of this is like the positive view. I don't know if it's going to be true, but most positive side of me says when things turn to such terrible, awful shit, and that people are actually suffering, like more than they are now, then like maybe we get to third world levels or something. I think maybe then it'll be a sudden turn, and you'll have like heads rolling. But I don't know if we can. I don't know if we have the spirit to do that anymore. And on the other another part here is you mentioned the boomers, and one of the things that they use as an excuse to bring in so many immigrants is that the boomers are getting old and we don't have anybody to replace them, right? They're doing this at the same time they're bringing in like an expanded version of MAID, like medical assistance in dying. And I just have this nightmare scenario in my head where the government, sort of like how they did with COVID, convinces boomers to suicide uh, instead of dying old, like
Yes,
living
and
as an old person.
you have a tweet right here. I was just looking at this today. I think you just tweeted it today, and I'll read it for people. It says the Canadian government is going to solve the aging population by mating the boomers, aren't they? Does anyone else see it coming? Do boomers are they going to sign up to save Canada and stop the spread of aging? And I've known some friends of ours who had said that they've known some individuals who, in their own lives, are pursuing this.
Hmm.
Where the rubber meets the road in your life. Have you seen this in your life with boomers?
I haven't. I talked my grandfather out of it. I don't think he was.
Really?
I wasn't sure if he was going to do it, but he was really old, and he was like his mind was totally fine, but his body was just like collapsing, like this is slowly dissolving, essentially, just breaking right down. But I don't know if he didn't say it directly, but he was talking to me about a year before his death when I went to go visit him, and he was sitting in the bed because he was sick. He got better actually before dying this spring. Um, but he was sitting there and he's like, I feel like I'm useless. I feel like I'm just a burden on everybody. So I just told him like from my view as your grandson, I think you're the most important person in the family because you're the oldest. You have the most experience. All these young guys like my uncles and stuff, they're old, but they're not as old as him. I was like, what, like you're sort of like a guide that can kind of, in a sense, predict the future for them. So losing you is actually a huge tragedy for the family. And after that, he was all spry, so he wasn't like depressed anymore, which was nice. But sometimes you just needed like they just need a nice word.
That's a very poignant point, because I wonder how many seniors and boomers, especially, they'd probably say the same thing, like, "Oh, I'm a burden on people. Oh, it would be better if I weren't around." In that case, the medical assistance in dying could be counted as a death of despair.
Hmm.
And I experienced something somewhat similar with my grandmother, um, on my Ukrainian side. We call her Baba. She had 4 kids, and she still ended up in a fucking nursing home.
Hmm.
And I don't know, it just seemed that by the end she felt like no one was really caring about her, and she was right. She was correct because her fucking kids put her in a place where there's raving lunatics that reek of shit and sold her
Hmm.
house and whatnot. I'm getting all riled up talking about it,
Oh, it
but
pissed me. It pissed me off, man.
yeah, and so how, and that's interesting how made could be to take advantage of that, because part of me was thinking, and some people don't like it when my mind wanders down these obvious paths, but I'm like, how often would MAID be utilized by non-whites? How many Caribbeans, how many Muslims are taking advantage of this? Or does it seem to only be done by like depressed old white people? I would be interested to see the statistics on that. Now, what do you think about that?
I don't have the stats, but I have what's that called? Not personal experience, but if my mother was a nurse, and almost everyone that does it is non is a white, and they're
Yeah,
usually old.
yeah. It just, and that could be a couple of things. That could be that white seniors are just not being kept by their family. That's something that we see. We see them being
Hmm.
shoved into nursing. Look at your average nursing home. how many non-whites are in there. A lot of the times they're with their family, the non-whites. So that's one thing. The other side is like, is this being pushed in some way more to whites, or do they feel, it could also be said that, the old stock Canadians, let's say the Anglo stock, the French stock, like they have more of a desire to feel useful. And so if they don't feel useful, then they're like, I might as well just lay down and die. So that, I think, in your story was the core of that. Like they need to feel like they're participating. Because, if I
Mhm.
was like, I just watched the other day that movie that could have been great, but it's pretty good, is The Irishman. That was
Mhm.
only really smudged by its use of de-aging CGI. Otherwise, it's a very good movie. And the way that ends with Robert De Niro's character just like sitting there useless in a nursing home waiting to die. Everyone's dead. No one's coming to check on him. I'm like, I bet not only is that an experience I see um, shared by boomers, I like to think ahead for like, what the fuck are the millennials going to go through? Like, if you're a millennial, you're my age. Hell, if you're a Gen Xer, like, it ain't going to be much better for you. I'm getting ready for Gen Alpha to fuck us over. We don't have the tools to like whatever the boomers might have been in a position to pass some stuff on. It's like you know we're gonna have nothing from these younger generations. What do you think about that?
I think boomers really dropped the ball because like culture is something that you pass on generation after generation, and standards are things you pass on generation after generation. And it's so easy to just drop the standards. To like stop doing your Christmas dinner, stop doing your Thanksgiving dinner, stop putting candy out in Halloween. So easy just to do nothing, and that's what I see a lot from boomers. I'm hoping we can get some sort of renewal from the next generations because I talk about this a lot with my children, like about how like I'm here as your parent. I'm here to teach you things. So I'm going to teach you things. You're not going to like it because you're going to find it annoying because you want to do something else, but you're just going to have to deal with it. And I feel like boomers were more of a hippie-ish, like, oh, do what you want, like no standards, no, no attachments, no duties.
Yeah,
I,
and that was also Gen X as well, because my parents, bless them, were very similar. One example was when it came to religion, like I wasn't raised in any church, but I also wasn't raised atheist. I was
mhm.
just raised, it wasn't even talked about. They just said, we're going to let him figure it out. And the same kind of went for everything. And I wasn't really, they were present, and they provided a life. So they didn't do anything objectively wrong. But, for a young man, especially, you really do need some guidance. If you don't have that, you'll search for it in any huckster, grifter, cult of personality you could find. But there was like generations that were like, you know what, the way to do it, the modern way to do it is let the kids raise you or something like
Oh
that, right?
yeah,
Some
it's
bullshit.
it's insane because like kids have no idea what the fuck's going on. Like they have no fucking clue, and I can tell you that from experience. Like kids have no fucking idea what's going on. You have to guide them. Like if you don't like at least lay out a structure, they have nothing to build on.
You know what? I was thinking this other day too. There's that old Sam Hyde sketch where he's the father talking to his son and just smoking cigarettes and giving him kind of shitty advice. But I'm like, even shitty advice is better than no advice. Like a dad telling his
Yeah,
like 13-year-old kid, like, here's how you get a girl. And even if it's like way off base, like it's better than nothing. Then you have like a 12-year-old like going on the internet, like, oh, how do I meet a girl? And it's just pedophiles. That's all you're gonna get.
yeah.
And it's like you need give some kind of mooring, even if it's flimsy, right? So I think that I'm a recent father myself,
Well,
and
congratulations.
well, thank you very much. How many kids do you have?
I have three. I had my first when I was 18, then 21, and then when I was 28.
Well, and honestly, that's a very interesting way to go about it, because I bet, has your parenting style changed as you have aged as well? Would you say?
Well, when I was younger, it's crazy. Like, cause I sort of have two generations of kids. The first two, and then the third one. And when I was younger, I had so much energy. I could like chase. It was awesome because I could like chase them around. I'd never get tired. And they get tired as shit because they're young. They're little kids, right? And but now with the newer one, I notice I have a lot less energy. You know, I'm just beaten down, I guess, compared to what I used to be. But um, if having kids young, I think is like a really good idea. Like, despite there's drawbacks to it, but if you can find if a guy can find a good woman and they work together, I mean, I'm not saying I did that because I had a divorce after my first two, but which wasn't my fault, by the way. But but anyways, my point is, if you have them young, it's just so much better for the kids. It's so much better for you. Um, and then by the time you're whatever 30, they're sort of big kids now, and it's not so hard.
Yeah, I'm in my 30s, so I had my first kid when I'm in my 30s. So I have no idea what that's like, but I do notice, I can imagine what it's like. And as a dad of a young child in his 30s, you make a lot of noises like this. Oh, here we go. Like a lot of whoa. It's like an excited groan is the best way I could describe it.
Yeah,
And so I'm wearing a lot of more loose fitting clothing because I have to get on the floor and get up and do flip him around, and
yeah.
it is just being in
And
your
you're
thirties.
like,
Like
oh, my knees.
honest, dude, I'm noticing that I'm like my legs feel like they're fucked. They feel like they're on the way to being busted. And that
Yeah,
scares me because I do squats and shit. Like I work out. I'm active. I don't jog or nothing, but like I'm trying to get the legs on. But I'm like, that's not helping.
yeah. No, for sure. The knees thing is definitely. I've noticed
We have
that.
we haven't solved knees, have we? We haven't solved this bone shit. We're still dealing
It's a
with
weak
bones.
it's a weak point on us.
Yeah. Imagine having a kid when you're like 50.
Oh man, just brutal.
I wonder what that's like. Like when I watch like Succession or something, and like a 75-year-old man's trying to get a to him, which is very young, but the woman's like 42, get her pregnant. And I'm like, that's a strange dynamic, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You
You
gotta
never hear
start
about that.
younger.
You always hear about like older women giving birth to messed up kids because of their genitals, but I'm like, busted sperm can't be much better. I
Oh,
have to believe that.
it's just I think that causes autism or something like that. It's one of the causes.
Look,
Older sperm in an older woman.
on a long enough timeline, autism is the best you could hope for. Let's just say that. But you do raise a good point, and this, believe it or not, people, this pertains to what we're discussing. For younger generations, this is something we talk about on the show a lot now. Um, the example you gave of boomers and Gen X could be, and various generations can be blamed on this, but kind of losing the traditions and you feeling like you have to keep them going with your kids. That's something myself and my wife deal with as well. We find that our parents aren't terribly interested in like doing Thanksgiving dinner. So it's like, okay, we got to do it. But I'm like, oh, if I was fucking retired, I'd be hosting everything at my house, not them. Their version of retirement is not doing anything anymore ever. So that meant that, oh, all the stuff you did in the past, you didn't like doing it, which is, I think, I think if there's a point of differentiation that our generation will have to answer for, it's that you actually have to like doing these things, because it seems that the previous generations just did it to keep up with the Joneses, but you actually have to believe in this stuff. And so what I see with young families and young men and young women in our political milieu is like they're feeling like they have to really rediscover this stuff and really believe in it and not just pantomime it. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, actually, this is I didn't think about bringing this up earlier, but I wrote an article called "The Boomer Cruise," and it kind of talks about this whole idea about how the boomers, their whole life, sort of like a cruise, right? Like ultimate boomer life would be cruising down the highway on their cruise in their cruiser, and then going on a cruise to Mexico or the Caribbean, and then coming home and you know getting bored of home, and then going on another cruise. That's like their ultimate reality, right? But for us, I don't know if that would be fulfilling. At least for me, I don't think that I like traveling around the world and like learning new things, but I don't think I could spend it on a cruise ship. At least not maybe not more than one time.
Yeah, I went on a cruise ship once in my life. It was one of those Carnival cruises, And this was when I was in my 20s and I was single and I was smoking and drinking. So that's what I did on the cruise. But if I wasn't, and I don't drink anymore, so I'm like, I don't know what I would do on a cruise. If you're not smoking, drinking, gambling, it's just like old people and kids. But
Yeah.
they love it. They go every fucking year, and a lot of older people in my family, they love the cruises. They love, like, my in-laws just went on like a 2 week tour of Europe. Now, what that means is they spent like one day in every city, and then that one day was it was just boat cruises. You get off in Paris, there's the Eiffel Tower right there, and then you go on a boat cruise, and they give you a middling dinner. And but that's for them. That they said, "Oh, I saw it out there. I saw Big Ben. I saw the Eiffel Tower. I saw the Leaning Tower of Pisa." I'm like, "But you didn't get to pretend like you're holding it up. That's the whole fucking reason you go there, dummy. The doy." And but then our generation is like, "Oh, let's kind of spend some more time there." But yeah, the idea of just kind of passing by something, maybe that is a generational rift. I'd like to. So you said that article was called "The Boomer Cruise."
Yeah. And what kind of I kind of thought about it later because like I wrote that I think a couple months ago. But after my grandfather died, I inherited my these pictures that came from my grandmother's aunt, or sorry, my grandmother's sister, because she didn't have any children. And I was going through it, there's lots of old photos from different parts of the family. And then I come across hers, and it's her travel photos from Europe in the 70s. And she went on like this European cruise or whatever. And I just got thinking because I do a lot of genealogy stuff on the side, like keep track of my family tree and stuff, and I pass that information to my family so they can, oh, you're related to Alfred the Great, this many generations or whatever. Anyway, so I tell them that sort of stuff. Anyway, so I'm looking at these pictures and I'm just thinking, this woman was my great aunt. She had no kids. Like I have 10 cousins in my generation, and each of us have, and altogether, I think there's like 22 great grandkids. But of all the people, I'm the one that inherited this book of her pictures to Europe as a single woman. And just like, imagine if she was like, watching me from heaven or whatever, and like this person, I never met her. Like I might have met her when I was a little tiny kid, but for me to inherit it is just kind of strange. There's something surreal about that.
Yeah, what do you think that was? Why do you think she left it to you?
Oh, she didn't. She left it to my grandmother,
Oh, okay.
and then my grandfather she passed away in 2007. So he lived till now, so it was with him, and then they got passed to me.
Yeah, there's
Because
probably not.
I'm the only one that cares, I guess.
No, honestly, I'm noticing that as well. That previous generations, that they're kind of dumping all of these memorabilias and these photo albums. And it's getting difficult because my son, he's only a few months old, right? But he doesn't have the experience of having a lot of cousins because
Mhm.
I just have one sister. I didn't come from a big family. My wife didn't come from a big family. She was an only child, and my sister didn't have any kids. So it's like he's got no fucking cousins. He's got like great, I don't know, his cousins twice removed or whatever it is from my cousins. But I'm like,
Second
the
cousins, yeah.
yeah, like the pool of immediate family you can hang out with is dwindling, and even within 3 generations, it's down to like a few people. And I
Well,
don't think that's uncommon.
in South Korea, I think the next, in not too distant future, for every great grandchild, oh, sorry, for every great grandchild, there's going to be 100 great grandparents.
That's crazy.
Or maybe it's four. Maybe for four great grandchildren, it's going to be 100 great grandparents, which is nuts. Like that's just like total devolution. Like absolutely, that's like it's like getting a camel through the eye of a needle to get your genes forward.
Yeah, and that I'm interested to hear your thoughts on, because a lot of people will say that the birth rate falling is a net negative for society. Like, let's take Japan for an example. Their
Hmm.
falling birth rate, because a lot of people forget that the baby boom impacted everywhere. There's a baby boom worldwide at around the same time. But I'm wondering how much of it is sort of these dysgenic pressures affecting us, and how much of it could be seen as maybe population numbers normalizing. Now, this wouldn't be true, obviously, in Africa and other places that are problems that they're booming, but a lot of the boom in certain countries is propped up by foreign capital, right? If you just remove that, it would normalize itself. But
Hmm.
I'm wondering, is there an argument to be made that maybe the the declining birth rate is more kind of just reverting to the mean in some countries? What do you think about that?
I think that's the case. Makes me a little sad, like to know that my kids will have like one, maybe two cousins. Um, but what am I supposed to do about it? Force my family to breed? Like a lot of my cousins have kids, but like I have one half nephew. That's it. And then I have my sister-in-law has a son. So that's it. Two nephews.
Well, and that what's interesting there is that you're representative of the, let's call it, the native stock or the old stock in Canada dwindling, and the government saying that, well, to maintain this infrastructure, we must bring in tens of millions of people, which obviously doesn't make any sense. But in your second article that I was going to talk about, infrastructure deficits, this is another thing that I think is important. That in terms of, because when you're talking about young families like we are right now, a lot of the reason
Hmm.
people don't want to have a big family is because they can't afford a house, or they don't have access to what could be seen as a good community. But I know a lot of younger guys, including myself, who are looking for a house right now. And one thing that I always remind people to look at when they're looking for a house, especially if they're looking for a deal right now, because you need to find like a good steal right now because everything fucking sucks up here. But I'm
Hmm.
like, if you do find a deal, pay close attention to the water and sanitation of that house,
Hmm.
because anyone who knew anything about houses who I've talked to said what really matters is where your shit goes. Full stop. Like a lot of the
Yeah.
times the deal's like that's messed up, the plumbing's messed up, and it's a tear down, the
Yeah.
basic stuff that no one thinks about. And you have this line here because in regards to the competency crisis, people think of, oh, everything's getting kind of worse with our infrastructure. But you have this line here is that even assuming we catch up somehow in our sanitation and water infrastructure, we will have fewer than half of the doctors, engineers, pilots, scientists, mechanics, tradesmen, industrial farm equipments, and manufacturing. This is assuming we can even get a drink of clean water or have indoor plumbing. So, on one hand, we've got the declining old stock of Canada, which were the most competent. And what do we do about that? We might be able to do so. Like, I think we could keep things running if we didn't have the competency crisis on the other end of the spectrum, which is just inept people ruining everything.
Hmm.
And then on top of that, there's the fact that once one thing starts to collapse, it all seems to have a domino effect. And it starts with the things you don't think about. And all of a sudden, the power isn't on as much as it used to. Now there's this thing called brownouts. When's the last time we talked about a brownout? Well, maybe that starts hitting southern Ontario in the next 10 years because the people just don't know how to maintain all the electrical lines and stuff. That is that a serious problem you see impacting us in the near future?
If we don't, like right now, we're actually losing ground on almost all our maintenance. By about what either I think it's 1.5% per year of our water pipes degrade, and we repair them at zero point 0.5. So every year we're falling behind. I mean, the degraded pipes will still work, but they're at risk of bursting at any moment. Essentially, like they're like the glue is worn off of them. Let's say. So if we don't fix that, like, so imagine if you don't have water, because that's sort of essential for high functioning societies. If you don't have water, you have nothing. Like we're in Mad Max scenario. Like we're at the point where we'll be at the point where if you're living on Vancouver Island, like I was kind of worried about this at one during COVID. I was like, fuck, if I don't have I don't have a gun because I can't. You can't. It's hard to as shit to get guns over here. So I was like, oh, I'm gonna buy a pellet gun. So if I need to shoot a squirrel or something to get some protein, I can do that. And then I bought a book about foraging in the forest in this area, so I could like forage for like crap in the woods to eat. Because I was like, well, if the water goes and the supplies go and like we don't have anybody working, there's going to be nothing to you can go to the store with all your money, but there's going to be nothing to buy, right? So I thought I'd get a little bit ahead, so I bought some books and I bought that pellet gun. But yeah, I think that is going to be a serious problem if we have more and more people coming, because you know can you run a country on guys that work at Tim Hortons? Like that's the highest they can ever get. I don't think you can.
How much of this is government ineptitude and how much of it is sort of malevolent design on their part? Like how like I know we talk about Justin Trudeau being an inept leader, but do you think there's some grand scheme behind all this? Because on its face, it looks ridiculous.
I think I think it's almost completely incompetence. There could be some scheming, but it'd be hard to point to. On a thing on this scale, I don't think it can be scheming. I think it's got to be incompetence, and it scales. If you do you ever listen to Edward Dutton?
Yes.
He talks about this. We're losing like 1.5 IQ points every decade on average, which at the ends of the scale really cause problems. Like you end up with a lot more really, really stupid people and a lot fewer smart people. So all these people that be running complicated systems, they're gone. Now you got people in the second order that are now operating those systems. And at some point, they're going to be gone too. So then we're going to have like average midwits, like like our prime minister, okay? He's literally a middle school drama teacher. That's his competency. And he happened to be the son of Pierre L. Trudeau. But that's it. That's all he's got going for him. This wouldn't
Yeah.
fly in any other country.
Justin Trudeau is such a fascinating political phenomenon because some people will say that, oh, he had the name of Trudeau and that has some political capital. And I would say, have you asked the people who voted for Justin Trudeau what they thought of Pierre Elliott Trudeau?
I've
Most of them
never
don't
met
know.
I've never met
Yeah,
a Justin Trudeau voter in my life. I asked.
that
I've never met one.
I've known like the because I had some dealings in my late 20s in politics on a municipal level here in Ontario and where I was living at the time. And we were working with an MP in the area in a marketing capacity because myself and my wife, we both work in marketing. We're working
Mm,
at a local MP's office who's a liberal. And I remember when Justin Trudeau was running, and it was decided within the party that this is going to be our guy. And unlike in American politics, you can't really dissent within the party. Like you imagine the Republican Party, like how many of them dissented against Trump, right? That
hmm
didn't happen here. In fact, any MP that was against Trudeau getting into office was expunged from the fucking party. Like you saw people just disappear because they weren't on board with the new guy. So they had to have a unanimous support for this guy. And I thought that was fascinating. And I'm like, I guess that could explain. So if you were a liberal voter, you were just voting for the party, and this guy was just in the fucking party. Aside from like guys like my father-in-law who just voted for him because he wanted weed legalized, and I guess that was a pillar. But I'm like, everyone's like, oh, Trudeau. But what does the Trudeau name really fucking mean? Does anyone know anything about Pierre Trudeau? Why did you guys like him? Is he like a Bush? Not really. Like I could tell you about the Bushes. I could tell you about these other, families, the fucking Kennedys. But what capital does Trudeau have? So it's like this is just a fucking guy who's here who nobody respects or even particularly likes. Like they were trying to make us think that Trudeau was like handsome. No, he's not. He's dopey. No, go ask women. Like the most I heard women say about Trudeau was they liked his hair. That's what you say about a gay guy.
I do have some suspicions on that regard.
I forget where I was reading it. It was probably from one of those people that we follow. But with his divorce from Sophie, I wouldn't be surprised if he comes out as maybe not gay, but he'll say like, "I am." Like, imagine that terrible voice he uses. Like, what's the voice like? It's kind of like raspy. Like, "I am an LGBT member of the community."
Pansexual.
Yeah, like he'll say he's bi. He'll say something, very corporate, and
Oh,
he'll
man,
try that. And yeah, yeah,
I hope he says he's bi because I wrote an article about how bisexuality is fake. So it
E-
would just mesh really well.
yeah. Everyone knows it's fake. It's gayer than gay because you can't even commit to being gay.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
It's being bisexual is closer to being a lesbian. So it's a man saying he's a lesbian. And
Yeah,
again, I don't think that reads well. I don't think like everyone was talking about how, oh, maybe like Michelle Obama will run, or like people. There's this theory that I think has some traction that one of the reasons Hillary Clinton couldn't be elected was because her husband had an affair on her. And people have strong opinions about sexual things. Like people generally don't care if a man has an affair, but if a woman does, that's worse. And if the man cheats on the woman, like you're seen as like a failure as a partner, or you don't have the vitality, or a man whose wife cheats on him, he's seen like this loser of a guy. You can't do that politically. So the idea, like if Trudeau's wife left him for another man, it's like, deep down, people are going to think he's a loser, and I think there's no way back from that. That's my
Yeah,
opinion, anyway.
no, I agree on at least on that regard. I think their marriage is kind of there's this picture that they showed. I think it was on Instagram. I'm not sure, but it was they're driving in an RV, and it's like if someone's taking a picture from behind, and Trudeau's driving, and then Sophie's in the passenger seat, and they're like holding hands. But like usually a woman when they do, because I've been in this situation, they like kind of lean towards you a little bit, right?
Yeah,
At least a hair. And this, she was like almost faking like she was leaning that way, but she was kind of like 1 degree away instead. And I was like, oh man, if I had seen that, I would have called it right away. But I mean, they didn't. I don't haunt their their Instagram page. So
break out the green lines and figure out whether this relationship is healthy or not.
exactly, yeah.
But yeah, so the problem with the infrastructure that we're talking about, you go into a great depth in this article, but you have a calculation in here like between relative time units and the actual infrastructure deficit given a numerical value, and that by the end of this, that the amount of money and the amount of competency it will take to run this machine will just run out. And would you predict just a total collapse in that scenario?
I think either it would get to the way I looked at it is that eventually you get to a point where you don't have enough water. Like you need 2 liters of water, let's say at the beginning to live, and at some point you'll be like owing 800 mils of water, and that's only like 30 years away, or by 2036 or something like that. I think I wrote, and so but that's just unrealistic. You'd collapse way before that. Like what I'm saying is like by 2030 we're probably up shit creek. Like if we don't figure things out, if we don't fix the problems we have that are growing, we could be in a huge problem later on.
I think one possible outcome, and I've seen this described by even the likes of Peter Zeihan. I think there's this other creator, What If Alphist, recently. A lot of people have been talking about this, about the breakup of Canada and what that would look like. And for what people say about Peter Zeihan and people like him, I get it why people might not like him. But in his book, which we had covered on the show, Disunited Nations, he did make a valid point that every province in Canada individually has a greater trade relationship with America than it does with each other. So you would imagine a crisis scenario hits Canada. Let's say there's not enough fucking water. You might see Canada start to break up piecemeal as America starts to swoop in and solve that issue. And maybe it starts with Alberta. I think Ontario would be the holdout. I think when we had the Black Horse on, people can go back and listen to that interview with the Black Horse. He was describing the relationship between the East versus the West and the Laurentian elite over here in Ontario and in the Maritimes versus the rest of Canada. So I'm like, okay, I could see Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes holding out as one block, but fuck it, I can see Saskatchewan becoming like an effective asset of America. Infrastructure
Mm.
wise, that's how they get in. I could see that with Alberta. I can
Well,
sure as shit see
there's a lot of
Manitoba.
Americans that moved to Alberta actually during the Depression, including my own grandmother. Her family moved up in like 35, and just because the land was basically free, and so there's a lot of American influence in Alberta as is. That's kind of why they are the way they are.
Yeah, like I can easily see, British Columbia might present some problems, but I think there would be a great interest, especially from the American side of, owning the Rocky Mountains and the Alberta oil. Like there's a lot of interest in there. So you could effectively see a Canada that's just Ontario and the Maritimes, and maybe they bribe Quebec, but I don't know. Maybe I don't see Quebec being on board with that either. And so now it's just Ontario floating there.
Yeah.
That sounds grim. And like I think the way you get there, like you said, is maybe it's a crisis scenario. Someone has to save Canada. They've got in too deep. They can't figure it out. So who's going to do it? Well, obviously America. I'm not saying that America is engineering this, but I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if they don't have a plan to take advantage of that if it occurs. What do you think
Well,
about that?
it kind of makes me think of this idea of the Caesar. Um, like right now, we probably couldn't imagine a Canadian Caesar, right? I kind of imagine Brett Wilson, but from Dragon's Den. I kind of imagine he could be a Caesar. Like he's got the money, he's got the personality, he's a little bit kooky. He's like a man of the people, and he's a billionaire. Uh, but the problem is like we don't have like an author. We haven't like authorized as a culture this idea of Caesarism. So like long before that could happen, we'd have to like sort of I have this idea that we sort of author him into existence, and then those stories sort of become he sort of enacts the stories that we've written that we need this to happen, and that sort of gives him authority to do it. And then people see it happening, and they're like, "Yeah, well, that's as the myth said. This is the destiny that we're supposed to go through." But we're not at that point yet. We still have to like author that. But I think that this breakup of Canada, it is possible that one could arise from within instead of like the United States riding in on a white horse or whatever. But I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I think before anything like that, we need to reconcile the East versus West conflict in Canada. There's a lot of internal struggle that a lot of people globally are not aware of that I think prohibits any form of real unity more than people think. Like Canada is a very disjointed nation right now. And it's falling apart because it doesn't, one thing I've always talked about before, in a few episodes, we covered the trucker protest. I think last summer, however long ago it was, everything blurs together. But one of the points I made was that the state apparatus simply didn't have the manpower to stop it. And we experienced this because we're in Ontario, where the hub of this was, so we got to even see it pass through our towns. And there's no question in my mind they wish they could have stopped this, but they just didn't have enough cops, they didn't have enough feds, they didn't have enough money to really stop this. And so I think that proved to the world that Canada just doesn't have the capacity to even really defend itself internally, which presents unique opportunities for dissident movements and even breakaway groups within Canada. But that also means that Canada is very, very wobbly right now, which is what leads me to your next and final article that we're going to cover, which is titled Exodus. And this is the one you delivered at the Shieldings event. I wondered if before I read from it, if you wanted to talk about that event, talk about the reading, any feedback you've heard from this article, because what it deals with is that question we began with, which is, should I stay or should I go? Should I fight for Canada, stay within Canada and fight to the bitter end, maybe, or break off, leave somewhere else and maybe start fresh?
So my speech when it happened when I was at this event, my bag was delayed, so I actually traded positions with another guy so that I could, he would go first, then I could. My bag was arriving late by this, like I guess Uber sort of thing that delivers bags when they're late. Anyways, my bag was coming, so I got
Competency crisis, am I right?
yeah, yeah. So I got Esso Centerist, Sensible Esso Centerist, if you know him,
Oh yeah, I know him.
from Beowulf Foundation. He went first, fellow Canadian, Um, anyway, so my seat arrives during his speech, so I go get changed, or whatever, and I come down and I open up with a quote from Dostoevsky's *The Idiot*, and it's Prince Mishkin, who's the sort of the title character. He's recounting an experience when he was in France, witnessing a execution or the procession before an execution, then the execution. He doesn't actually talk about the execution itself. It's about the guy walking to the gallows, or not the gallows, the guillotine. And he's like imagining him like walking slowly. Every block, he's like every step he takes, he's like, oh, there's like so many more steps until the end, right? Like he's like rejoicing that like he has another block to live, and every step he takes up to the guillotine is like, well, I have like 7 more steps, you know. Anyways, but then he gets to the top and breaks down and cries. And my point with that was to talk about how at some point it's going to be too late to make a move. So you have to really think about it. Because maybe you should choose to fight. Maybe you should choose to stay. Maybe there's something worth saving here. Or maybe you get slaughtered like a pig. So you have to make that choice. And actually, that I did Exodus wasn't long enough really to make a full talk on. So the reason why I opened with that because I amalgamated another one of my works. It was called Interregnum, and it's about how basically democracy is entropy. And so I go through all this speak, and then I finally get to my point on Exodus, and essentially the idea is, what if we lose? Like, what if the left and entropy wins? They take the day. We can't do anything about it. They start trying to churn our kids out, and we have nowhere to go. What happens then? What if they follow us, right? So I thought, well, what if we had like a little settlement somewhere else, or some of us set up a settlement that was like a refuge for our philosophy of truth and justice. I believe I use the terms, and so that was basically the idea. And the area, I had a couple of options. One was Polynesia, another one was Siberia, and then I also chose South America, but specifically not the north of South America. I mean, like sort of Uruguay, Paraguay, and southern Brazil, maybe even Argentina.
Yeah, I have it
Um,
here. South America along the Brazilian, Argentinian, and Uruguayan border, near or along the Uruguay River.
yeah,
Around, but not limited to, the small town of Barra de Cari. I'm
oh,
probably pronouncing that.
Barra de Caray. Yeah,
Voila.
and it's well, my wife's Brazilian now, so um,
Ay, ay, ay.
which is kind of funny. Um, but she believes everything I believe, which is the main point. Um, so but after I did my speech, I actually before I went there, this guy from Belgium got a hold of me, um, and he's actually moving to Paraguay, and because there's this town there that got set up by these crazy German people during COVID because they were tired of the COVID rules in Europe. So they moved and set up this whole town. It's all these like super uber competent boomer Germans that like know how to like dig big wells and deep like 200-meter wells and stuff like that, and like they do landscaping. They have all this money that they're just like pretty wealthy retired German people that used to own like companies and stuff. So they built this town there called Paraíso Verde, which is like green paradise essentially. Um, so I included that in the speech as well. But basically, the idea is to set up like sort of like a place where you can kind of escape to during the collapse and then rebuild it. It's sort of like the idea of Edward Dutton talking about Neo-Byzantiums, which is essentially during like a collapse, like a medieval collapse, Constantinople still existed, and like boatloads of like intellectuals and stuff from Britain, for example, sailed all the way to Constantinople. I think 200 ships full of intellectuals and writers and noble people, merchants, and so it kind of held the civilizational light aflame until it could be rebirthed, or at least spread from there. I mean, I don't know if it really worked out, but because the Turks eventually conquered them, but by that time Europe had sort of resurged. So that's the basic idea. It wasn't to run away, but to, if things are so messed up, like I could imagine like I go there, or a cohort of like Canadians goes there, sets things up. Then England just gets totally screwed. Like the UK is totally messed up. It's like all communists and stuff. And then like academic agent, we bring him in on like a refugee visa, and then he lives in our town. You know, like something like that. It's funny to think
Yeah,
about, but we could get there.
I'll find a job for academic agent.
Oh, there'll be
Now,
unlimited work.
and so I'm just going to read a quote from that article really quick. So I think you put it very well here. It says, to stay means you will fight this ghastly circumstance for as long as you're able, with which you will bequeath your heirs. They ideally will continue your pained struggle. With each subsequent generation, your progeny will flip a coin, and we hope our legacy endures. Oblivion, the return to the Edenic bestial unconscious, looms over these men of courage, ready too for the return to paradise. In all likelihood, this chaos path is the death of man as a creature of God. His light extinguished will never again illuminate the earth. The alternative sacrifice is Exodus. One might extricate oneself from the permanent purgatory of imploding empire and search out alternative locales to colonize. Ridiculous? It isn't. And then you rule out completely some candidates. So we've actually given a list just a couple minutes ago about prospects. You said let's rule out these ones. For example, most Western European nations, Canada, USA, and most of Southeast Asia. Well, I'm curious why you might rule out Southeast Asia. Why might that be?
That's too many people. You'll just get
Okay.
absorbed into the either you get destroyed, outbred, or just get absorbed into the culture.
That seems to be the one destination all like the the white expats want to go, though, isn't it? They want to go to Thailand and shit.
Pussy's cheap.
Yeah. Uh, I wonder what the going rate of pussy in Uruguay is either.
Oh, it's
You
actually
know,
more expensive in Uruguay. Argentina is cheap.
I don't know much about South America, but I'm fascinated by it because I think South America is going to make a big play for global, relevance in the 21st century.
Well,
Something's going to go on between America and South America. I'm pretty sure.
if you go to Rio Grande do Sul, which is like the most southern state in Brazil, it's like 90% white or something like that, and it's mostly German and Italians.
Yeah, I'd heard about that. Like, I keep hearing stories about these, like you just said. Here's a town of rich, like boomer Germans who just went there. But then there's all these stories of like, oh, yeah, here's a bunch of Italians, and it turns out there's always these colonies of fucking Germans all across South America,
Yeah,
including one famous German.
yeah. Oh, there's actually a couple towns that you in Argentina where you can't really enter them. They're sort of a little bit on like the low end of the hills near Cordoba, and you can't go inside. Like there's guards with MP40s at the front.
Hmm, that's interesting.
Well maintained MP40s.
I guess the big question that we are asking ourselves right now, as young vanguardists or dissidents or whatever, as we look at, like we talked about before, cycling back to the beginning, about what values and traditions we actually want to maintain and rebreathe life into and carry over. How can we be sure that we don't just photocopy the parts that led us down the road to where we are today? I know that's a great big fear on the dissident right broadly. Now, do you see any, like, how could we as Canadians, as Canadian men, old stock Canadians, not repeat the same problems that led us down the road to this Canada? What do you think?
Well, I think one thing that like I was never raised religious, um, but having my experience in Brazil and just seeing like the difference in like how things work there, um, I think without the problem with not having religion is then you don't have a central moral principle. Everything just becomes convenience or what feels good. And like for like one good example of this is like this the COVID vaccine crap. Um, at first they say, oh, it's not going to be mandatory, right? And then suddenly it basically becomes mandatory. People are losing jobs and whatever. And that means there's no principles behind what they're doing because they already set their word. And plus, one of our principles is bodily autonomy. So you shouldn't be able to, if you're a liberal, you're supposed to be in favor of bodily autonomy, right? So there is no principles. But if you have, and even if the principle was you don't have bodily autonomy and you got to take the damn shot, at least you have a principle about it, right? But we don't even have that. So it's just everything becomes sort of chaotic and whatever serves power essentially. It's no longer about what's right or wrong. I'm not saying like things are necessarily right or wrong either because I don't know. I leave it to the guy in the sky. But But our leadership definitely does not have that in mind. Justin Trudeau is the top of the hierarchy. There's nothing above him.
I got one question for you. Within the Exodus article, there's a part here near the end titled "Order," where you give a bit of a shape to this project that we're just discussing now, and I'll just go read it here. It says, perhaps it's just an exercise to reflect upon your current paradigm. We must consider the structure of power for long term stability. History demonstrates that the longest lived systems had a feudal character, or what Hans Hermann Hoppe refers to as private government. Even Republican city states like Venice, Florence, and Milan were run by an oligarchy controlled by merchant families. Now, and you go on to talk about a city state oligarchy. Now, when I was reading this, it occurred to me that, oftentimes when people in our sector talk about parallel communities and societies and whatnot, it's usually just a group of middle class guys or a group of lower middle class guys. We tend to be from the same, you know, socioeconomic status. But I know I was talking to Charles Haywood not long ago on the show, a great interview people should go listen to. But
Mhm.
he was taking a very, very similar approach by saying, like, look, in a collapse scenario, you're going to end up with, he didn't use the word warlord. Other people have used it about him, but something like, I have the resources, I have the compound, I've got everything. People will gather around me. And it leads one to believe that, in these situations, like you're outlining here, like with these merchant families, you will kind of need someone with those resources. Like, and I do wonder, if we're talking about parallel societies and all this, do you need at least one well-moneyed or successful individual to kind of act as the nucleus for it?
Yeah, there will be a need for patronage, like because a patron can't do it all himself. He's going to need lieutenants. He's going to need competent people that he can trust. But those lieutenants are also going to need support from him. So that's why I kind of thought of it like as even if it's merchant, I see it as feudal because it's this patronage thing. You're not necessarily getting paid, but you know, um, your house is guaranteed because the baron is saying this is your house essentially, and you have to sort of also provide a service to the baron or whoever the merchant family whoever's your patron. And the thing is that it's personal. It's not like, oh, I had you hired, but our business went bad, so you're gone. You know.
Right. And in these circumstances, a lot of people will approach this from an ideological, spiritual point of view, but it seems that the system in place is just economic and materialist. Like, ideology aside, you will just be adhering to whatever that feudal lord will do. And I think one thing that concerns me is that we need to be able to tell the good, well moneyed individuals from the bad ones. Like, I don't think we actually have, and I'm not trying to criticize anyone in particular here, but in our quest for patronage on the right, that's something you hear a lot. Like, we need more patrons, we need more guys with money. I worry that we don't know how to delineate between good patrons and bad patrons.
Hmm.
Like, I don't want us to jump at like the first guy who says he's gonna start his own fucking Jonestown or something, right? Like, we haven't really
Yeah,
had
yeah.
that discussion on the right, really.
That actually came
We're
up.
just we need money.
That came up. Dave, the distributist, he brought that up as one of the questions after I finished my speech. You know, about Jonestown because that's kind of what I was describing was similar to what happened with that. Though I was saying like, oh no, like you got to be. I'm not telling you what to do. You have to think about this. You have to think. You have to actually have a plan. You don't go running in blind into towards out of the trench into the fog. You have to. You kind of have to have your plan ready, and you have to be able to trust what you're doing. You can't just don't just jump in with Jim Jones. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and the Jim Jones situation was, that deserves an episode in itself, really unpacking that. But it seems that one of the best, like the best acorns with which to plant this tree of a society would be something like, like a band of brothers or like a war band of some type, like the founding of Rome or something. Like,
Hmm.
you need like a network of really driven men, especially not so much like, hey, here's a bunch of families following this guy, and I don't know exactly how to do it right, but I know there's examples that work and there's examples that don't work. And I think that's an interesting discussion to have. And I'm not trying to poke holes in anything, because I think that's just the natural state of things.
Hmm.
And as we look into like where resources are being allocated, we'll need to employ more of these guys who have resources, but who don't just want to have slaves or something like that. And I don't know how to negotiate that. I'll be the first to say, like, I'm in uncharted territory, especially with a generation of guys who don't really have mandatory military service. A lot of the commonalities between these guys don't exist for these younger generations, and especially most of the guys who are endeavoring to do this are not even linked geographically. Like, you're across the fucking country right now. Like, most of us don't have a bunch of guys in our area we can do this with. So that presents different. Like, how do you all come together? And that's why we were discussing that book a few episodes ago, The Network State, which is how would you digitally bring people together, and you don't necessarily need to be within the same region. You could coordinate the purchase of land. And that's why I found the Paraguay example very interesting, because within this book, he was describing, like, okay, like, you could pool resources and literally just buy a fucking town and move there. And like, once you own land, then it becomes real. And
Hmm.
you could buy it in a place that wouldn't even be that expensive. And then there you go. Now we have something real to build from. Now, within that book, he's a very technocratic, very sort of Curtis Yarvin type guy, where it's like, oh, how do we do this? Well, we'll have the entire constitution on the blockchain. Everything will be the blockchain, and the blockchain will solve everything. I'm like, okay, well, that's, you can be a bit too technocratic about it, but you do need to solve for simple things like, how do you prevent despotism, or how do you make sure that the values that bind you are explicit enough to keep you together long term.
Well, that made me
uh,
think about the you said about despotism there. As I think for any power system, I think one of the things that liberalism really fails on is the necessity of a higher power above the state or whoever is the leader, that he or they draw from in order to not become tyrants, like not the good tyrant, the bad tyrant. And so I think, like, if you created say a new model, perfect, not perfect, but a new model civilization, you have to have like that religious element, because if you don't, then what's to stop the bottom guy from just killing his way to the top, and what's to stop the top guy from killing everyone so that they don't take over his position.
Now let me ask you this. So, you make a very solid case for Exodus, and there's a lot of people right now who might be thinking about leaving Canada or leaving different parts of Canada. Um, Even if you are convinced that Canada will break off at some point, it's like, well, maybe I still stay here. I'm curious about you. How bad would Canada need to get before you would leave, or do you imagine yourself leaving in the short term, or what would that look like?
Guaranteed, I'm not going to retire here. I'm going to retire there, just because it's so much more bang for your buck. At least at the moment, I don't know. Maybe a dollar would be worth nothing by that point. Um, but if I can leave earlier, I'm going to leave earlier, because I think I think things are going to get much worse here if nothing changes. I mean, things could change, right? Like, Maxime Bernier could get in, we could become a libertarian paradise or something. I don't know.
Well,
But,
my concern is that if it became a libertarian paradise, I wonder if that would just accelerate the problems too.
yeah,
Like, I think,
exactly. Yeah, it could get worse.
like, the issues are, like, unless you take uh, aggressive, coordinated measures to reverse the flow of migrants and address some of these problems, I'm like, it's over in a lot of ways. Like, not to sound too
Yeah,
defeatist here, but like, if you look at the migrant flows up until now, it's like, well, like, barring anything extreme, barring an extreme measure that I don't even think we're bureaucratically capable of at this point, it's like,
yeah.
well, it's just a matter of time, it seems. You're just trying to think of what unforeseen thing could happen to make it even worse in the short term. Like, I guess it would be like a natural disaster. It would be like a war, like some, maybe there's World War III. I don't know. That could speed it up. But other than that, it's like I'm not optimistic for the next 50 years, and I don't see how you could elect your way out of it, if that makes any sense.
Well, that reminded me of this idea I had a couple. It was from a couple years ago before Jordan Peterson was on the Benzos. Back when he first kind of got big. And I remember thinking, like, if this guy told me to march on Ottawa, I would do it. The truth was, he'd never do that. But I remember that feeling, and I remember I was talking to guys I know, and they were like, "Yeah, if he said to march on Ottawa, I would." But he
You know,
didn't. So I
a
don't know.
lot
I
of
think that there's a chance, but
a lot of people like to retroactively, paint over how big that Jordan Peterson phenomena was. Like, if you were kind of living through it and paying attention, like, that was a looking at him now, it's very strange and pathetic and hollow. But at that moment, like, damn, like, that was the level of celebrity that you usually don't see for someone talking about like weird nigh esoteric stuff. Like, he's talking about like Jungian psychoanalysis of mythology. Like, he shouldn't be filling out stadiums talking about that, but he is.
mhm.
I guess Deepak Chopra does that in a sense, but he just talks bullshit. So hey, maybe he can, but that was wild to see, and it really did capture a lot of young men and led them on a path, many of them, to where we are now as
Yeah,
arrestable psychos.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know, the people that he would probably denounce now as troll demons or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Anonymous
like,
troll demons.
but that feeling, like the feeling of here's someone who's got their finger on the pulse, here's someone who's got a whole generation's number. That was an interesting phenomenon. I don't see anything like that. I think Andrew Tate tried to be that, and people were in love with the idea of having that guy again. So they're like, "Oh, Andrew Tate, he's like that." I'm like, that's not the guy you want. That's something far worse, I think. But yeah, who else, right?
It's gonna get worse before it gets worse.
Yeah, it's gonna get way worse. But these are hard questions that people need to ask themselves. Like, do one thing that I have mentioned before, and again, I don't want to be too much of a bummer, but I will. I think people always talk about the historioidal cycle, which is, good times create weak men create bad times, that whole thing,
Yeah.
and hard times create strong men. And a lot of us are convinced of that, and that the hard times are coming, and that will birth the new Faustian man. And I'm like, well, also, hard times can create broken men that stay like that for 1,000 years. And that's
Hmm.
actually more common in the world. It's more common for really hard times just to have an oppressed people that just are broken. They're buck broken for the rest of their existence. So, like, keep that in mind, that things can get so bad that you never come out of it. Or you
I
just become like a vassal people indefinitely.
That's another reason why I'm like thinking of leaving is just because like there's so many people here that are just completely buck broken, like cucks that don't like have any spirit left in them. Like, you go to Brazil and there's guys slapping chicks' asses. They're all laughing. The chicks even laugh because it's just regular there. And like there's a spirit about the place. But here it's like, oh, you can't do that. Oh, you can't do that. You might offend him or whatever. Or you might offend her. Oh, that's sexist. My own father, the boomer, called. So we were driving down the road. I was helping him, or he was helping me do something with helping my mom out or something like that. And we were driving down the road, and I saw this chick on the side of the road, and I was like, oh, it's a Japanese exchange student, because they're wearing like the Japanese exchange student clothes. They all wear the same fucking clothes, and there's lots of them here. And it wasn't. It was a white chick, and I was like, oh, I guess I was wrong. And he's like, that's pretty. What's he called it? You stereotype her. That's kind of racist. I'm like everybody. So I just said like everyone's racist. Like, you're racist too. And he's like, well, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. And I was like, well, do you prefer your own kids or do you prefer strangers? And he's like, oh, I prefer my own kids. I'm like, that's the very basis of all racism. Racism is just a term used to make you turn against your own people and help some nebulous concept of humanity that actually doesn't care for you. It's like a communist ploy essentially. But he has no fucking clue what's happening, and that sort of thing like makes me think like, why am I here amongst these people? I could go over there, and they're the same ethnicity as me down there essentially. I'm a little bit more Anglo, obviously. I have a little bit of Dutch in me, so it's sort of like German. But they're just so much more alive in South America. And everyone here is just sort of like a giant pussy.
Well, one thing that gave me pause was that in America, I detect a sort of vitality and a vivacity within their conservative movement, and people can mock the Republican Party and the conservatives, correctly so, for a lot of cartoonishly dumb behavior. But like there is this sense of like the conservative American as like a powerful masculine force.
Hmm.
But then I look at Canada, and I remember the last election we had with Trudeau when Trudeau was elected, and it was the People's Party of Canada, which was never going to win an election, but it was trying to make its mark. And I think Maxime Bernier, they had one seat in the House of Commons previously, and then there was the election, and the People's Party of Canada did worse that election. And I believe they lost their seat in the House of Commons.
Yeah, that
And
was the
so
Maxime Bernier seat.
and this was I believe it was at the peak of COVID. Like COVID was on everyone's mind, so this would be the time for the People's Party of Canada, ostensibly our only right libertarian selection here in Canada, and it did worse. And it seemed that Trudeau did better. And I looked at that and I said, okay, well, what did I learn? There's something going on in this country that I don't understand because, by all logic, like everyone says they hate Trudeau, but he keeps doing so well. Okay, what's that about? You know what I mean? Like I see more fuck Trudeau bumper stickers than ever before, but I'm like, there's something going on where it's all talk, or it's just I'm just noticing it where I'm at.
He
But
he
the fact
they
that when the votes are counted, the guy that people should like did worse when he should have done better. I'm like, okay, there's something seriously broken in the psyche of this nation, and it's mostly with the old stock types. Sorry, I cut you off there.
no worries. I think he well what did he get, like 30%, 31% of the vote last election? So I mean he's barely squeaking by like that. The PPC, I think they got like up to 6% or something. Some places they got like 10 or 11. But my vision of the PPC isn't that they're ever supposed to win. My vision of them is that they're supposed to keep the conservatives from cucking, and it keeps they only steal about like 5% of their vote. But if they can steal that 5% because the conservatives aren't being conservative, that's a win because it forces them, like guys like Aaron O'Toole, whose like name is like the best name ever for this guy because he's a fucking tool. But he was basically just Justin Trudeau, but apologizing for it. So he was even
Exactly.
worse. You know,
And
but
that's
that but the
my only
PPC
concern is
pulled
that
it.
I don't see the PPC even having that effect anymore. Like I thought I did for a minute. And that I said the same thing. I'm like, well, it's here to represent a more extreme right voice that'll eventually pull the Conservative Party a bit more to the right. But I don't know. Are you seeing it? I'm not seeing
I,
it.
I mean, I think ultimately, like Pierre is just Pierre Polyev. He's just essentially just a liberal, but he's less of a liberal than O'Toole, and he's less of a liberal than Trudeau. So that's a win. I don't think it's going to really help much, but it's better than the alternative. It's like, do you want a shit sandwich or do you want a shit sandwich covered in vomit?
Yeah.
They're not
And
great.
yeah, like honestly, I'm telling people like Canada is such a mess. Now is the time to run an absolute schizo. Like Canada can see the dawn of the much celebrated rapist Hitler. You could have a rapist Hitler in Canada run for a party, and I bet he'd do. He can't do worse than what we got now. It's a blank canvas. Run a fucking guy with a knives for hands.
We could
Give
have
it a
like
fucking shot.
a TND party.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, you could because I mentioned this. I forget where I was mentioning, maybe on the last live stream, but there's this overwhelming sense in Canada that everything is fake. Everything, like it's a very socialist country, but there's this feeling that government contracts are always overinflated. The money isn't going where it's supposed to be. Everything seems like a scam up here. Everything feels like misappropriation of funds. Everyone kind of understands that when you see an Aboriginal protest, it's not actually the Aboriginals. They're working hand in glove with someone else. Everything's like a cynical shakedown. It seems no one's genuine, and I can't break that sensation that's like everything here just kind of it sucks and it's fake. And but with that, it means that you can kind of do whatever you want if no one really believes in anything, and if everyone is just it's like this, it's elite theory but a funhouse mirror of it. Like you can probably try some weird shit up here. Fuck, we got an entire province that's owned by China. That's pretty fucked up. What can we
Yeah,
do about that? Montreal is owned by like 5 different organized crime places, and everyone knows it, and no one gives a shit. We have a city here that's still owned by the mafia. That's pretty cool. Let's do something with that. Let's have the mafia party. I don't give a shit. If you told me that Newfoundland was owned by Russia, I'd believe you.
it's either fake, gay, or retarded. That's like the trifecta here.
Yeah, like in that trifecta, you have to pick retarded. You know, I'm done with fake and gay. I'll
At
take
this
retarded.
point, yeah, at this point, you got to go with it.
Because within retarded you can find beauty. Within retarded you can find the warriors of God. You're not going to find that in fake. You're not going to find that in gay. I tell you that right now.
Yeah, we want something real retarded.
Something real retarded. I think that's probably a good a place to end as any. I just want to remind people to check out your Substack. That is liquidswan.substack.com. You also have your work on praxarchy.com, and give him a look up on Twitter or X at Liquid Swan. And did I miss anything there or any links of yours?
I do have a YouTube channel, but I just do like D&D streams most Sundays at like 8 a.m. PST. So
So if we just look up Liquid Swan, will we find that, or is
on
that
on
something else?
YouTube, yeah, it's very small. It's like 100. I have like 122 subs or something like that. It's really small. But
All
there's
right.
hours and hours. If you like D&D content, man, I got hundreds of hours of that.
All right, everyone, check that out. I just want to thank you once again. This has been a fantastic talk. Thank you for taking the time to sit down with me today.
That was awesome. Thanks, man. Thanks for having me.
All right, I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.